I spent 20 years putting gravel in the bottom of every pot I owned. 20 years. And the whole time, I was making drainage worse, not better. Water doesn't move smoothly from soil into gravel. It pools right above those rocks and turns the bottom of your pot into a soggy mess. I wish someone had told me sooner, but that's how gardening myths work. They sound so reasonable that we pass them along to our neighbors without a second thought, and before you know it, everyone on the block is doing the same wrong thing. Today, I'm going to walk you through 10 of these myths that too many of us still follow, and I've got a few extras from my own hard-won mistakes over the years. By the end of this, you'll know why wilting doesn't always mean thirst, why your planting hole might be sabotaging your new shrubs, why that black goo on tree cuts does more harm than good, and a handful of other things that will save you time, money, and a sore back. Stick around, because number 8 changed the way I think about my entire front yard. Let's start with something I see in my own neighborhood every summer. It's July, it's 90-something degrees out, and your tomato plants are drooping like wet laundry on a line. Your first instinct is to grab the hose. I get it. I used to do the same thing. But here's what's happening. Those plants are closing down their leaf pores to hang on to moisture during the hottest part of the day. It's a survival response, not a cry for help. When you flood them with water in that heat, you create a warm, wet environment around the roots that invites fungal problems and root rot. The combination of heat and soggy soil is far more dangerous than a few hours of temporary wilt. So what should you do instead? Wait, go inside, have your iced tea, and check those plants again early the next morning when it's cool. If they've perked back up overnight, they were fine all along. If they still look limp at 7 in the morning, then yes, give them a good deep drink at the base. This one tip alone will keep you from overwatering through the entire summer, and overwatering kills more container plants and garden beds than drought ever has. In my garden, I started following this rule about 15 years ago, and my tomato harvests doubled within 2 seasons because the roots stayed healthy instead of waterlogged. Now here's something related that most gardening books skip over. If you're growing in raised beds or containers, and a lot of us are, because bending over a ground-level bed gets harder every year, those pots and beds dry out faster than in-ground soil. So the morning check matters even more. I keep a cheap moisture meter next to my back door. Cost me about $8. Before I water anything, I stick it in the soil 3 or 4 inches deep. If the reading is still in the moist range, I leave it alone. That little tool has saved me from drowning more plants than I can count, and it saves me from hauling the hose around on days my knees aren't cooperating. Let's move on to trees, because there's a myth about tree pruning that has ruined more beautiful shade trees than any storm I've ever seen. People believe that if you chop the top off a tree, you control its height. Topping. It sounds logical. Cut it shorter, it stays shorter. But that's not what happens. When you top a tree, it panics. It sends out dozens of weak, thin shoots from right below each cut. Those shoots grow fast because the tree is desperate to replace the leaf area it lost. Within a couple of years, the tree is close to its original height again, but now it has a dense, ugly cluster of branches that are poorly attached and prone to snapping in wind. You've traded a strong, well-structured canopy for a mess. The right approach is something called thinning cuts. Instead of chopping branches in half, you remove select branches all the way back to their point of origin. This opens up the canopy, lets light and air through, and keeps the tree's natural shape. If you need to shorten a tall branch, there's a technique called a reduction cut. You cut back to a smaller side branch that's at least 1/3 the diameter of the branch you're removing. That side branch becomes the new leader, and the tree heals cleanly. And here's a timing trick that works in your favor. Do most of your pruning right after the tree finishes its spring growth flush. The tree has already spent its energy producing new leaves, and by pruning right then, you remove that new growth before it can fuel another round of expansion. You're borrowing the tree's own calendar to keep it compact. One more thing on pruning that I want you to hear, because I see it everywhere at the hardware store. Those cans of black wound sealer, the tar-like paste people smear on pruning cuts. Please stop buying them. A clean pruning cut heals best when exposed to open air. The tree forms its own callus tissue around the wound. When you slap that goop on top, it seals in moisture, and over time it cracks. Those cracks become entry points for insects and disease, the exact things you were trying to prevent. There is one narrow exception. If you're pruning oaks or elms during the growing season, a thin coat of latex-based paint over the cut can prevent beetles from spreading oak wilt or Dutch elm disease. But that's specific latex paint for a specific problem on specific trees. For everything else in your yard, put the wound sealer back on the shelf. Now let's talk about something I hear from folks who are trying to do the right thing for their local environment. They plant native species and then assume those plants can fend for themselves. After all, they grew here before we did, right? The problem is, your yard isn't the wild habitat those plants evolved in. Your soil has been graded, compacted, and stripped of organic matter by construction. Your microclimate, the sun exposure, the drainage, the wind patterns, may be completely different from the hillside or meadow where that species thrives naturally. During the first year or two, native plants need the same attentive watering and care as anything else in your garden. The payoff comes later, once they're established and their root systems have settled in. Then they need far less water and attention than exotic ornamentals. But you have to choose natives carefully. A plant that's native to your state might not be native to your specific soil type, elevation, or rainfall zone. I planted a manzanita once that was native to dry California slopes. My garden sits in a valley where I was watering my roses twice a week. That manzanita got root rot within 4 months because I was killing it with kindness. Too much water for a plant that evolved in summer drought. So when you pick natives, look for species matched to your exact conditions, not your whole region. Your local extension office can steer you toward the right ones, and that advice is free. Here's another one that costs people money and frustration every spring. You bring home a beautiful new shrub from the nursery, dig a big hole, and fill it with premium bagged potting mix or compost because you want to give that plant the best possible start. Sounds generous. But what you've done is created a bathtub. That pocket of light, fluffy, amended soil sits inside a wall of your dense native clay or compacted ground. Water rushes into the loose stuff and sits there because it doesn't drain easily into the surrounding native soil. The roots love that cushy, amended pocket so much that they circle around inside it instead of pushing outward. You end up with a root-bound plant in the ground, which is the worst of both worlds. The better approach is to use your native soil as backfill. Dig the hole about twice the width of the root ball, but no deeper than the root ball is tall. Break up the native soil you removed and put it right back around the roots. If your native soil is heavy clay, you can mix in a small amount of compost, maybe 10 to 15% by volume, but no more. The goal is to force those roots to adapt to the soil they'll be living in for the next 30 years. I learned this the hard way with a row of hydrangeas I planted in pure compost back in 2008. They looked gorgeous for 18 months and then started declining. When I pulled one out, the roots had never left the planting hole. They'd grown in circles like they were still in a nursery container. Speaking of spending money, let's talk about fertilizer, because more is not better. Synthetic fertilizer is concentrated salt. When you apply too much, or apply it during hot weather without watering it in immediately, it pulls moisture out of roots through osmosis. That's fertilizer burn, and it can kill a plant in days. I've watched neighbors turn their lawns brown in August, trying to green them up with a heavy dose of granular fertilizer. Even if you don't burn the plant outright, over-fertilizing vegetables pushes them to produce tons of leafy growth at the expense of fruit. Your tomato plant grows 6 feet tall with lush foliage and gives you 4 tomatoes. That's not the trade-off you want. Organic fertilizers, things like compost, fish emulsion, kelp meal, release nutrients slowly as soil microbes break them down. They're almost impossible to over-apply. They feed the soil biology, which in turn feeds the plant. And they're safer to use in warm weather because there's no salt shock. If you're on a fixed income and watching every dollar, compost you make yourself from kitchen scraps and yard waste is free fertilizer. A basic compost bin costs nothing if you build it from pallets, and it turns your garbage into the best soil amendment you can get. I haven't bought a bag of synthetic fertilizer in over a decade, and my garden has never looked better. Here's one more on the topic of saving money and effort. A lot of gardening advice tells you to stake every tree you plant. The nursery sells you the tree, the stake, and the ties, and you assume it's necessary. But trees develop trunk strength by swaying in the wind. A staked tree that can't move builds a thin trunk with no taper. Take the stake off after a year or two, and the trunk can't support the canopy. I've seen trees snap at the exact point where the tie was, because all the strength developed above it, while the lower trunk stayed weak. The only reason to stake is if the tree can't stand upright on its own. Some nursery-grown trees have such thin trunks they'd fall over without support. In that case, stake loosely so the trunk can still move, and remove the stakes after one growing season. If the tree can stand on its own from day one, skip the stakes entirely. Now I want to shift to something broader, because it changes how you plan your whole garden, not individual plants. Too many of us start by picking plants. We see a gorgeous Japanese maple at the nursery, or we fall in love with a picture of lavender hedges online, and we buy first, plan later. I've done it more times than I'd like to admit. But plant selection should come near the end of your design process, not the beginning. First, look at your space. Where does the sun hit, and for how many hours? Where does water collect after rain? What kind of soil do you have? How much time and physical energy can you put into maintenance each week? Honestly, if your knees ache and your back locks up after 20 minutes of bending, a garden full of high-maintenance perennials that need dividing every year is going to become a source of guilt instead of joy. Answer those questions first, and the right plants will suggest themselves. For a low-maintenance garden in full sun with clay soil, you might land on yarrow, black-eyed Susans, and ornamental grasses, plants that thrive on neglect once established. For a shady corner, hostas and ferns. The design drives the plant list, not the other way around. And while we're rethinking design, let's talk about front yards. There's an old idea that a front yard means a front lawn, a rectangle of green grass that you mow every week, edge every other week, fertilize 4 times a year, water constantly, and walk across twice a day to get to the mailbox. That's a lot of labor for a space most of us don't spend any time in. You don't need a lawn to have a beautiful front yard. Ground covers, gravel paths with drought-tolerant plantings, a small patio with a couple of chairs. All of these can look better than a struggling lawn and take a fraction of the work. If you have grandkids who play in the front yard, keep a patch of grass for them. But if the lawn is there because you think it's supposed to be there, give yourself permission to rip it out. Some of the most beautiful front gardens I've seen are edible. A friend of mine replaced her front lawn with raised beds growing herbs, peppers, and strawberries. She gets compliments from every person who walks by, and she gets dinner from her front yard. That's a better return on a Saturday morning than pushing a mower. Here's a myth I haven't heard anyone else talk about much, and it's one that hits our age group hard. The idea that you need to do all your garden work yourself, by hand, the way you've always done it. You don't. There are ergonomic tools designed for people with arthritis and limited grip strength. Long-handled weeders that let you pull dandelions while standing up. Rolling garden seats so you're not kneeling on the ground. Drip irrigation on a timer so you never drag a hose again. These aren't luxuries. They're the difference between gardening into your 80s and giving it up at 65 because your body can't keep up. I installed drip irrigation in my raised beds 3 years ago, and I went from spending 40 minutes a day hand watering to spending about 5 minutes a week checking the system. That freed up time for the parts of gardening I love: pruning, harvesting, sitting in the shade and watching the bees work. One more original tip before I wrap up, because this one saves a surprising amount of money. Stop buying new potting soil every year for your containers. That old potting mix from last season still has structure and drainage. Dump it into a wheelbarrow, pull out any roots, and mix in about 20% fresh compost. Fluff it up, re-wet it, and use it again. Potting soil is one of the biggest recurring expenses in container gardening, and most of it can be refreshed instead of replaced. I've been reusing the same base mix in my big patio pots for 3 seasons now. The plants grow fine. My wallet is happier. So here's what I want you to do today, right now, before you forget any of this. Go check your garden for one of these myths in action. Maybe it's a staked tree that's been tied up for 3 years and needs to be set free. Maybe it's a pot with gravel in the bottom that's holding water instead of draining it. Maybe it's a fertilizer habit that's due for a change. Pick one thing, fix it this week, and see what happens. Small corrections add up to a garden that works with you instead of against you. And that's what we're after. A garden that gives you more than it asks.